welcome everyone. My name is Laura and I'm the School and Public Programs Manager here at the Maritime Museum of BC. And where I am right now, I am on the territory of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, who are the Lekwungen speaking people. And for the Maritime Museum, that's really important because those people have been known for their stewardship of the environment and the waters around this area for millennia. And so it's really great for us to be able to work on a territory with those peoples. If at any point in time you'd like to say anything in the chat, please feel free to just say a quick hello. And also, I did make a quick poll because we're interested in seeing where people are joining us from. So I have just a little poll to kind of get a gauge of where you're all visiting. Hopefully you can see it there. I'll give people a little bit of a chance to answer. All right. Okay, great. And I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so we have most of us are from Victoria, but it's actually pretty cool to see that a lot of people are joining us from the United States today. So welcome to everyone who's here from out of country, out of province, and out of the city of Victoria. It's great to be able to have people from all around. I would also like to, of course, introduce our speaker today. This is Alex Zimmerman, and he's the author of the book Becoming Coastal, 25 Years of Exploration and Discovery of the British Columbia Coast by Paddle, Oar, and Sail. And he's here to talk to us about his book and about the self-propelled adventures that he's had along this coast. Alex will be taking questions throughout the presentation, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have any that you would like to ask. And without further ado, thank you so much, Alex, for joining us, and I'm really excited to hear everything you have to say today. So I'm going to pass it on to you, and I am going to be muting myself and turning off my video at this point. So remember, in the chat, please ask your questions. We'd love to hear them. Okay, on to you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Laura. Okay,
Great.
so this is the book called Becoming Coastal. So the presentation is going to be about some of the experiences on some of the journeys described in the book, and then some will be specific to a particular journey, others will be representative or typical of some of the journeys, not all of them. This is an overview map of the various journeys I describe in the book. The red dotted lines trace the journeys and give a sense of the ground covered. It's the BC coast. You'll notice that north is not at the top. I've kind of skewed it to fit the format of the screen. The blue dotted lines show the maps that are in the book. Victoria's down here, Prince Rupert is the other end of the BC coast. This is Haida Gwaii, Vancouver Island, Vancouver, and the Inside Passage. But let me go back to how it all started. I mean, I first came to this coast when I joined the Navy in 1975, and that's where I learned my basic seamanship. Not much chance to learn that where I grew up in Winnipeg on the prairies. And I learned my basic seamanship on HMCS Mackenzie here. And when I left in 1977, I only stayed in the Navy a couple of years. I knew I wanted to come back someday, but that chance didn't come for 13 years. So we did get back here in 1991, and what I found was that, you know, while the coast has been occupied for well over 14,000 years, it was mostly new and unknown to me. So in 1993, that is to say, my wife and daughter and I took a canoe trip to the Broken Group Islands on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. And that's us, and you can see the Broken Group there. It was a great trip. It really whetted my appetite, but after that trip, my wife decided that she really wasn't a sailor, and I decided after some high winds that an open canoe was probably not the best craft for open water, big winds and waves. So I built a stitch and glue kayak in 1993-94 along with some friends, two identical ones. And then a few years later, I built a double of the pretty much the same design. And then a few years after that, somebody had given me George Dyson's book by Darka. I built and so I got all fired up and built a folding by Darka. and immediately after that, flew with it up to Haida Gwaii for a nearly month-long solo trip, and that was in 2001. But that story comes a little bit later. So after a number of shorter trips and more protected route around the Gulf Islands, my first big solo trip was to the Brooks Peninsula, which is on the outside of Vancouver Island, about 2/3 of the way north to the tip. So there's two ways to get there by kayak. One is you can make a long drive on bad gravel roads to Fair Harbor, which is a day's paddle away from Cayuquot, which is this little place down here. Or the second way is you can put your kayak on the coastal freighter here called the Uchuk 3 at Cold River and spend a day traveling down Nootka Sound and out and around to Cayuquot, where they drop you off. It's a cool old boat. It's a converted World War II minesweeper, 128 feet long, a lot of salvaged equipment from big ships, and they have a really cool wet launching system for kayaks. The Brooks Peninsula is a mountainous spine roughly 5 miles wide and 10 miles long that sticks out more or less at right angles to the north coast of Vancouver Island. And because it's so mountainous, it creates its own weather, which is frequently different on either side. Often the strongest winds on the coast are recorded at the Solander Island Light off the tip of the island. But it's thought that the peninsula was never glaciated and during the last ice age, and it's never been logged. So it's old growth. There's never been a mine on it. So it's pretty much untouched by man. But it's not untouched by humans. I mean, partly due to its geography, beaches catch all the plastic that's been dumped into the ocean. And when I was first there in 1997, I spent a day windbound and I walked up the shoreline as far as I could get in a day. And all these logs that you see here are actually just totally intermingled with tons and tons of plastic debris. It was really disheartening to see, and I can't imagine that it's gotten any better since that time. It kind of gave me a hint of just how much we're affecting the planet. But it's still a pretty amazing place. And I'm just going to read a short bit from the book about my first trip on the Brooks Peninsula. At 2 o'clock on the morning of my last night on the peninsula, I crawl out of my tent for a pee. I look up and nearly forget why I have gotten up. It's absolutely still and quiet calm. The sea is soundless and the sky is crystal clear. The air is so still and stable that the stars aren't even twinkling. Each star is as hard and as unwinking as a laser. The lesser magnitude stars are so bright that it's difficult to pick out the familiar constellations. The Milky Way is splashed across the sky like a spilled bag of diamonds. Suddenly, I comprehend that I'm not looking at a pattern of light against a two-dimensional background, but I am seeing the disk of the galaxy edge on. I experience a moment of vertigo as the sense of the vastness of even our small corner of the universe fills me. For an instant, I am no longer standing on the surface of the earth, but I'm clinging to the side of some gigantic spaceship about to fall off and go wheeling away among the stars. The feeling quickly passes, but it is a rare glimpse into our place in the universe. Perhaps we humans aren't equipped to contain such immensities for more than a few heartbeats. The chill night air soon drives me back into the warmth of my sleeping bag. The year after I did the Brooks Peninsula south side trip, I decided I'd try and get down to the north side. So I went to the Quatsino Sound. This community of Cole Harbor is about 20 kilometers by road from Port Hardy, which is off the map to the top right. And you cross Holberg Inlet, get through Quatsino Narrows, and here's the Sound. And the red line shows my route, and that's kind of the mouth of the Sound. And the Brooks Peninsula is south of just off this map. It's not really considered a prime kayak destination because there's been an awful lot of logging activity, and there's a mine in a mill and further in the inlet. But nonetheless, it was a pretty interesting trip. I never saw another kayaker for the whole time. And there's some really delightful spots, and one that I was most taken with was Mahata Creek, not too far from the mouth. And here I tied my kayak up to a rock that was shaped kind of like a bollard and managed to have a really nice bath in this waterfall. Well, an eagle flew over top of me. It was kind of a magical moment. So twice I tried to get around Sound and head south to the peninsula. First day I started too late. The wind was up before I got to the mouth, but I tried again the next day. I got up really early and got a few miles south past the sound, it's really offshore, but by 9 o'clock, the wind quickly picked up to more than 20 knots and kicked up 3 to 4 foot waves on top of the underlying, 1 meter swell that's always there offshore. And I suddenly knew I was in over my head. So I turned tail and ran, and I made it to this little cove near the entrance to Winter Harbor. Winter Harbor is to the right here, and that's Quatsino Light there. And that evening, I had one of the strangest experiences I've ever had in my life. I'm just going to read it, passage out of the book, as I find it here. I retreat to my tent as the mosquitoes come out in force after the sun goes around behind the tree and the shadows creep out from the forest down the beach to the water's edge. I sit with my back to the zipped up screen door of the tent, totally engrossed in my novel. Suddenly I'm pulled from the world of the book back to the present. It is as if someone has tapped my shoulder to get my attention. Compelled by an impulse I don't fully understand, I scramble out of the tent and shove my sandals on to stand, waiting for what I don't know. I stand there uncertainly for about a minute. Then, about 100 yards along the beach, upwind of me, a huge male black bear steps out of the bush. He starts to amble along the beach, sniffing at the wrack along the high tide line. In a couple of minutes, he will be right beside me, as I have pitched my tent just above the high tide line at this end of the beach. I am momentarily frozen with indecision. Several possibilities flash through my mind. Should I just retreat into the trees and hope he doesn't notice me or the tent? Should I grab the paddle and the kayak and try to launch it and sit out in the bay until he passes by? Should I try to scare him off? The moment of indecision passes and I give a mighty shout. The bear looks up and lumbers off into the trees right under where I have hung my food bag. He doesn't move as quickly as I would like. I go over to the kayak and untie it, ready to drop it in the water should he return. After about 10 minutes, there's no sign of the bear. I get back in the tent, thinking about what has just happened. What is it that interrupted me from my absorption in the book? It isn't anything conscious that I can identify. A year after Quatsino Sound, I decided on something a little bit more ambitious. So in early June, I loaded the kayak on the Queen of Chilliwack at Port Hardy, and they dropped me off in Safety Cove on the east side of Calvert Island. Launch service isn't as nearly as slick as the U-Chuck 3. It's basically boot strength manhandling. You can see us launching it off the back deck there. But I paddled south on a stiff tailwind, beautiful sunshine, white horses chasing me 9 miles to Grief Bay here at the south end of Calvert Island. And at that point, I discovered that I didn't have a chart with me for the outside of the island where I had intended to go. So I changed my plan, and the next day I went across to Fury Cove in Schooner Anchorage, beautiful whiteshell beach there. Very popular spot with yachts. This might be place to say something about weather. Although I didn't fully realize it at the time of this trip, I hadn't had that much experience. The North Coast is a very different animal weather-wise than the South Coast. This trip, I alternated between wonderful sunshine, pouring rain, and gales. From Fury Cove, I paddled north as fast as I could to get ahead of a front that was predicted to come in, and I ran into low cloud, fog, and rain that's typical of the North Coast. But the next day, I managed to reach this magnificent beach on Choke Passage, north end of Calvert Island, and where a gale blew in the middle of the night, and I was stuck for 2 days. These wide, broad beaches look really beautiful in the calm and the sunshine, but you have to ask yourself how this much sandy beach gets made, and of course the answer is wind and waves. And so beaches like this can be pretty hostile if you're exposed to them too long in the high winds. And as the beach dried out, I had to retreat into the trees behind it to avoid getting sandblasted. And as it was, when the wind dropped, all my gear had totally filled up with sand. So I remember that Bidarka that I built. This was the first trip I took a week after finished building the boat. I packed it up and put it on a plane to Sandspit and Haida Gwaii, and put it together in the driveway of a friend of mine, and he dropped me off at Moresby Camp. So here it is, first day fully loaded for that month-long trip in a kind of a national land. This is a map of the north end of the park, Waihanas, basically. Sandspit's just off the map. Moresby Camp, where you can get to by road, is where he dropped me off. And you can see the kind of the meandering route that I took on the north half. Hot Springs Cove is down here. This is one of my early camps on the Guayanas trip. It's a Vertical Point, the bay beside Vertical Point on Louise Island. It was the site of some early European homesteaders in the area. And then there was an artist that lived there in the mid 1970s, and she built a cabin which was still there when I was there in 2001. So it's kind of, it's said that the gods look after children and idiots. You can see where I pulled the boat up here and I just left it there while I went to scout out a campsite, and I took a picture back down of the boat. So I duly got everything out of the boat, dragged the boat up, set up the campsite, had supper, watched the sunset, went to bed, and woke up at 5 in the morning with this sudden sinking feeling, thinking, geez, maybe I hadn't moved the paddles up. My paddles are two-part. They pull together and are put together and come apart. And I always paddle with them tied to a tether, but rather than untie the tether, I just take the paddles apart and reassemble them the next day. Well, I neglected to pull the paddles up the beach at 5 in the morning, running along the beach and running on the rocks to see if they'd washed out. And they hadn't. Now, fortunately, I carry a spare paddle, but I figured my first set were gone forever. So I packed everything up and got going in the morning, and it had been calm overnight. And the tide had come in, picked the paddles off the beach, taken them out of the bay, and then we're in the process of bringing them back in. So not 100 yards out, there were the two paddles, halves of the paddle floating not 50 feet apart. It was a humbling lesson to pay attention to everything all the time. This is a little further south of Hot Springs Cove. It's an island called Wanderer Island, and this is at sunrise. It was just a beautiful morning. But as soon as the sun came up, the mosquitoes were ferocious, so I packed up and got out there in a hurry. But just, one of the rare, beautiful sunny days I had in Haida Gwaii. This map shows the kind of the south end of Guayanas, Hot Springs Cove, where everybody kind of converges, and then the other places. I'd been hearing stories from other paddlers and other boaters, people at Hot Spring and other places that I'd talked about, Akita Point. If you're heading south, you got to get out from all the sheltered area and get around Hackett Strait. And I'd been hearing stories about Akita Point. A little reading about that experience. I want to get around Akita Point while the winds are still calm or light from the overnight lull. The first part goes as planned, the ebb tide and the calm winds part, but I haven't anticipated the ebb tide flowing contrary to the northeast swell. The swell originates out in Hackett Strait and is running 3 to 5 feet high. Off Akita Point, it is ugly. With the swell both coming into and rebounding off the point and opposing the ebb current, the waves are absolutely chaotic. There's no way to predict which direction the next wave will come from. Waves lump up out of nowhere, leaving half the boat suspended over nothing to crash down on the other side. Some of the wave shapes are nothing short of fantastic, with square sides and tops. On top of all the big waves are zillions of little tiny wavelets, as if from a light wind, except that there is no wind. I've never encountered conditions like this before. It is deeply scary, but the worst part is not knowing if it will get worse. I did eventually make it around. One of the things I saw was Skangwai, which is a Haida village that had been long ago abandoned. And it's on an island a couple miles offshore on the west side, not the sheltered side, but the Hackett Strait side, but the outer exposed coast. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of all the totems that have been, that somehow escaped being collected by all the museums. It was an interesting trip out there because the fog came down low and it was bright sun above it, and so I was paddling by GPS and compass, but there was so much light and light reflected off the water in the fog that there was no. It was like paddling in a separate sensory deprivation tank. I literally couldn't see the horizon. The water was mirror flat, and it was the most disconcerting sensation. But I did eventually make it, and this is what you see. I ended the day back a few miles east on another set of little islets called Gordon Islet on this black sand beach on the east side, and spent a couple hours repairing the stringer on the back deck of the kayak, which I managed to crack when I inadvertently sat on it earlier in the day. And that was kind of like the most isolated campsite I had, I would say, in that whole trip. the northeast coast of Vancouver Island, there's a set of islands called the Broughtons. Port Hardy is this way. You can see, and Alert Bay is just off, around the corner of Cormorant Island. I returned to the Broughton several times, as you can see from all the tracks of the trips. My first trip was in 2002 solo. That's one of the dotted red lines. I came back with my daughter in 2006. And then in 2014, there was a group of 4 of us like-minded Sail Lenora boaters. We spent a week there in September in 2014. And also in 2018, I came by on my way south on Johnson Strait, but that trip isn't in the book. One of the village sites in the Broughtons, Memcumlis, or it used to be known as Memalilakula. And when I was first there, Kwakwakiwak Mem from the village, Tom Seward, was there giving tours, charging people a few bucks and telling them all about it. And he'd actually done his master's in anthropology on this village, and it was one of the ancient fortified village sites. And there's a lot of raiding up and down the coast of the various tribes, loot and slaves and so on being taken. But this village is at least 6,000 years old, and they know that because the carbon from the old fires at the bottom layer at the edge of the beach are at least 6,000 years old, and they carbon dated it. And so, the shells from the midden and the fire ashes from the midden are probably 12 to 15 feet deep. It was quite interesting, Tom talking to us about the features of this fortified village, and one of them I discovered by myself. There's a broad, shallow bay in front of the beach as you come paddling up to it. And the day that I was there, the tide was fairly low, and I kept banging into these rocks, and I couldn't see. The water was rippled and kind of cloudy. When I got to the beach, and then you go up and hear Tom tell a story, those rocks were placed there deliberately to try and have a chance of incoming war canoes, because beach like that, sandy, normally wouldn't be full of rocks, but that one, so that was the first line of defense. Second one was the bank was cut away steeply, so you couldn't scramble up it, and they had notched logs as ladder. And then kind of the third, so the defenders could chuck stones and rocks and arrows down on you. And then the last thing was they had a kind of a backdoor cove they could retreat. But according to, he said the local stories, the village had never been successfully attacked. So not all of my trips were solo trips. I'm an extraordinarily lucky man, and my adult daughter, before she was married, wanted to come with me on a few kayak trips. And so it was a delight to be able to share with her some of the places I'd been before, the Gulf Islands, the Broken Group, the Brooks Peninsula, and the Broughton Archipelago. I've had a lot of memorable encounters with wildlife over the years. Most of them are undocumented by pictures because they were so fleeting, but one of the most amazing was an encounter with wolves during my first kayak trip to Clayoquot Sound near Tofino. I'd come down the night before from the north and camped in White Sands Beach Park, and set up the tent behind one of these giant logs that was lodged halfway into the sand. And when I got up in the morning, it was totally socked in, foggy. And so I retrieved a food bag and had all the breakfast stuff laid out on the log in front of me. And then suddenly out of the fog, these 3 wolves appeared just the other side of the log, less than 10 feet away. And I was so startled. But one of them started moving around behind me. I grabbed up my paddle. I'm not sure what thought I was going to do with defending against a wolf. And just as he was coming around, the lead wolf in front of me gave a yip, and all 3 of them disappeared off into the fog. It was all over in maybe 10 seconds, but they were almost, just out of arm's length. And at first I thought, were those really wolves? Because the village of Hauset is not too far away. That's, yellow eyes, big feet, thick fur, they all kind of look the same. Definitely wolves. But it was really quite amazing. And then my first encounter with humpback whales, I'd seen on previous trips gray whales up and down the coast as they feed and migrate north in the spring and south in the fall. But I'd never seen humpbacks before. But when my daughter and I went to the second time for the Brooks Peninsula, we were paddling across Battle Bay, and suddenly there's these humpbacks surfacing in the middle of the bay, and they're just about twice the size of gray whales. And so we were just absolutely enthralled watching these things. And what I hadn't realized is how noisy they were, all the grunts and the groans and the mooing and the squeaking. And that went on the whole afternoon and well into the night. And it sounded like this kind of herd of overgrown cows. It was a real revelation. After about 10 years of kayaking, my shoulders started giving me problems on long trips. And so I started wondering whether there was a way that I could have it all, row when there was no wind and sail when there was wind. So I cast around and found this design by Don Kurilko, who was living in Nelson, BC at the time. I ordered the plans and started building in 2003, but life and a few career twists and turns intervened, and it took me 1,700 hours and 5 years to finish the boat. I finally launched it in 2008, named the boat Hornpipe, which by definition is a lively dance performed by a solitary sailor. In the summer after I launched Hornpipe, I entered the shipyard raid. A raid is a part serious, part social series of racing legs for small engineless boats. This one had been run by Tad Roberts, who's a naval architect out of Silver Bay on Gabriola Island. The 2009 raid started in Silver Bay, which is down here in the bottom corner of the map, and ended up eventually on Harriet Bay, which is not on this map, on Quadra Island. And the most kind of exciting or terrifying leg was the second day when we went from Pilot Bay northwest across the entire Strait of Georgia to Jedediah Island. Nice gentle southeast quartering breeze to start with, and by the time we got to about 2/3 of the way, it was up to about 34 knots, which I didn't realize at the time. If I had, I think I would have been a lot more scared than I was. These pictures of me and Hornpipe were taken the next day in Malaspina Strait. We had strong winds, but they were only about 20 to 24 knots, not 34, which we had the day before. But they do give an idea of what conditions look like, but the wave height the day before were much higher. It wasn't all high wind sailing. There was lots of legs where it was dead calm and we had to row. So there's me rowing. But the champion rower was a guy named Colin Masson in this boat named the Bus Bailey. It's a fascinating boat, a piece of British Columbia history. It was built in 1931. It's a 14-foot double-ended boat called a handliner. Back in the 1920s and 30s, when salmon in the Strait of Georgia were a lot more plentiful than they are now, people would camp on the shore at night and then go out with hand lines and fish for salmon during the day. And then buyer boats would come by once or twice during the day and buy the salmon from these little boats. And then people would row and camp ashore at night, and they would do that all through the summer in the season. So it's basically a tiny little boat. So by far the smallest boat on the raid. And that day on Jedediah, crossing to Strait of Georgia, I figured Colin was going to be a goner because it's such a small boat and it doesn't have a rudder. He has to row it to steer it. It took me most of the way to catch up to him, but I did, and there he was, but he made it nonetheless. But it's it's remarkable to see what a small boat in the hands of somebody who knows what he's doing can accomplish. Let me say a word about totem poles. Many of the First Nations on the coast have a tradition of carving totem poles for various reasons. Some of the totems carved in the 19th century were still standing when I made some of my early journeys, but most of the totems were being left to decay slowly back to the earth, from which they came. This is a fallen over totem at Memcumlas in 2002. A really nice wolf's head. We went back in 2014. There wasn't a whole lot left of it. Totems are wonderful artworks, but I don't think we non-natives will really ever fully appreciate their emotional and spiritual significance. Even when the meaning is explained to us. These poles are at Skadams on Haida Gwaii, and this is a memorial pole. Each one of these rings represents a potlatch that was given by the person the pole commemorates. So okay, you can intellectualize that, but what did that really mean emotionally and spiritually for the people who looked at it and were able to remember the person who'd given a dozen potlatches? But every once in a while, I think maybe we can get a bit of a feeling. I was hesitant to include this image because it's not an ideal photograph in terms of quality, but it does kind of convey a little of what I felt when I came across this pole near Battle Bay on Vancouver Island. I can't really explain it, but I felt this distinct sense of menace or dread despite the bright sunshine of the day. I definitely felt unwelcome. I didn't hang around long, just time enough to eat lunch and have a bit of a look and then leave. I made a couple of trips with three friends who have similar boats, sail and oar boats. I think I mentioned that for 2014, the first trip was to the Broughton group or the Broken group in 2012, and 2 years later we went to the Broughton group, and this is the other half of the map that of the Broughton group that I showed. The blue line shows our sail and oar trip, including to the Booker Lagoon out here, which I'll talk about in a minute. It was a pretty fantastic weather year. It was the second week of September, which often the weather can be a bit iffy, but we had terrific weather for the most part, and you know, lots of wildlife, including the first morning out. We hadn't been out an hour and a half. A group of orcas came through. You can see right between our boats, spy hopping, showing their big fins. It was a pretty remarkable sight. One of the pluses of sailing with others, of course, is the social aspect. We generally always have breakfast and supper together, even if we sailed separate routes during the day. Although this picture is not either supper or breakfast, is actually lunchtime at Nemcumlas, the village in the Broughtons. So I'm going to try and show a little video here. I'm not sure about the video quality, depend on the bandwidth, but look closely. When we were in the Booker Lagoon, we overnighted there. It's on the edge of Queen Charlotte Strait. And as the tide was dropping in the morning, it was kind of like riding a waterfall to get out of it. But there was humpback whales just outside Cullen Harbor, which is just outside of Booker Lagoon. And they were a lot closer than it appears in this video, but let's see if we can see it. Up there if you look carefully. And one of them, I swam under the boat and came up on the other side of me, and I thought, man, if that thing comes up underneath me, I'm a goner. So we didn't linger. We got out of there pretty quick, even though the whales were pretty amazing to watch. Later that day in Queen Charlotte Strait, it was absolutely dead calm. I've never seen this section of the coast that calm before or since that day. It definitely reminded me of Coleridge's line in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a painted ship upon a painted ocean. So rolling along in the calm, you know, it gets a bit repetitive, and it's kind of into this kind of Zen state, just rowing along. When I heard this noise, it sounded like the curling wake of a powerboat, and except that there hadn't been any powerboats gone by for probably at least 2 hours. And when I finally, you know, kind of woke up and looked at it, it was a pod of Pacific white-sided dolphins. So I got this video of them going by, and there was hundreds of them. I almost literally didn't know which way to point the camera. Yeah, I figured they were probably hunting. I couldn't see what they were hunting, but they, you know, they weren't just traveling straight. They went, you know, back and forth. It was a pretty amazing thing to experience. So it turned out that trip was my last major trip in Hornpipe, because I decided to build a new boat. After 5 or 6 years of cruising in Hornpipe, I became dissatisfied with various aspects of it, so I designed my own boat and built it. It was about the same length because that's the size of my garage workshop, but a little wider, a little deeper, a little taller in the ends, a little different rig. It had some built-in stowage and watertight buoyancy compartments in the ends, better sleeping arrangement, handier rig, improved foils, centerboard, and so on. And I named the boat Fire Drake. And my friend Tim Yaden from Seattle had planned an inside passage trip in 2016, and I asked to tag along with him. And I managed to finish the boat about 2 weeks before and launch it 2 weeks before the trip. Got in one overnight trip to check things out. The boat floated the right side up and sailed pretty much as I expected, so off we went. Tim had left and sailed out from Seattle, and I joined him in the Gulf Islands. This shows where I joined him from Victoria and joined him about here. We got as far as the north end of the island in 2016 before we ran out of time. I'll talk more about that later. Tim had to go back to work, but the inside passage was unfinished business for me. So in 2017, I persuaded my brother to drive with me to Prince Rupert and drop me off. And then I headed south solo with Fire Drake because Tim couldn't get away that year. We had lots of navigational challenges on the inside passage trip. Fog was always an issue. It's always going to be a challenge in the summer on the North Coast. I found that I could see a little bit better in it than Tim could. So a couple of times I pressed on and made it round a point while he turned back and came on later when it lifted. And of course, when it's calm and you can only row at about 2.5 knots, contrary tides in narrow channels, it basically can halt any forward progress. So you just drop the hook and you wait for the tide to change. Here's a bit of video from Grenville Channel, I think, just give you a bit of an idea of what one of the long rowing days in the long channels is like.
So here I am, second day in the Grenville Channel. Lots of headwinds yesterday, got as far as Stewart Anchorage. I thought I'd try and get to Melian Anchorage, but that was across the strait. It was getting pretty ugly. Thought I'd have a good situation this morning with a flood current most of the morning. So I got up early, it was on the water by 6, and had about a knot of current with me for the first 2.5 hours, after which it switched, which is a considerable surprise because it's only halfway through the flood. So I've been toiling along on the shore trying to find a back eddy, or at least slack water, and doing reasonably well. Just enough wind to cool off and make for a little bit harder rowing, but not enough to sail, because I tried it once. So another 2 hours maybe should see me to the next anchorage. I don't know how to pronounce it. Kungsiat, I think, something like that. And I think I'll probably be done for the day because that'll be at least 6 hours of rowing. And I don't think there's much of an anchorage possibility after that.
So long days of rowing, did a lot of that. So in 2016, Tim and I were within a mile of Mistral Island in Chatham Channel, when the wind suddenly came up really strong, and we struggled in here the last 1.5 miles to the old abandoned marina dock, which is this guy down here. It's the public dock at the top, and it basically didn't drop below 20 knots. The wind for the next week. The channel next to it, just around the corner here, is marked on the chart as the blowhole, which should have been a clue. We basically only got out of there due to the serendipitous arrival of our friends Dave and Rosemary in their ketch, who kindly towed us out of the wind and down Night Inlet. Otherwise, we might still be there. So I don't know if anybody's here, been to Newfoundland or have ever visited there. If you have, you'll know what RDF is, they call it. it's an RDF kind of day by rain, drizzle, fog. And some days on the North Coast are just like that. And when the day that I left Clemtu, it was a serious RDF day, pretty much the whole day. You just got to buckle down and row. But on the other hand, sometimes heat is a problem. This is east of Sarah Point at the edge of Desolation Sound in 2016. High summer, not a breath of wind. It was the only day in both summers that I took off my life jacket because it was just too hot. It was so hot that when I put my life jacket down into the bottom of the boat, the sun melted the tube of lip cream, lip protection goop that I had in my life jacket pocket. Tim and I, in 2016 and me in 2017, we kept running into all sorts of unexpected kindnesses, you know, like Dave and Rosemary towing us out of there. But in Chatham Channel, just before we got to Minstrel Island, we were rowing up the middle of the channel, and this boat came up to us. But a few days before, we had been in Nanaimo, and we'd gotten there on the July long weekend, and we're at the Newcastle Island dock, which was a bit of a mistake because a bit of party time. But on the second night, we were waiting for the wind to drop so we could get across the Strait of Georgia. And I woke up in the middle of the night. I hear this woman's voice saying, "Help! Help! You won't leave! I can't get him out!" And I'm scrambling, saying, "What? You know, what's the problem? What can I help?" And then all of a sudden, it's, "Oh, no, it's okay. He's gone. He's gone." So, "You sure? Yeah, go back to sleep." So, in the morning, young woman and her son in this small powerboat had a cockpit cover over it, but she inadvertently left some food container out, and a raccoon had gotten in, and she couldn't get him out of the boat. She finally had to bonk it a couple of times with a fish gaff, and eventually it left. So didn't think any more out of it. But coming up behind us as we're rowing along Chatham Channel, this woman pulls up in the boat. She said, "I know you," and it was this woman Daphne that we met in Nanaimo, and she asked where we were going, and we said, "Well, we're headed for Minstrel Island. We understand there's a marina there that we can get showers and do the laundry." And she said, "No, that's old news. That's all closed years ago. But I'm caretaking for a lodge for a friend of ours who just a mile away, and there's nobody there. Why don't you come and stay with us?" So we did, and we slept on the floor of the main lodge, and got our laundry done, and spent a very pleasant evening with Daphne and her son. Totally unexpected. And of course, you always screw up something. You know, one of the ways you make progress in long channels against the current is to work the back eddies close to shore, and I mean really close to shore, within an oar length, hugging the shoreline. But most of the time, I got away with it because the shoreline's fairly steep. But in one place in Grenville Channel, it wasn't, and there was an off-lying rock that I didn't see until the last second, and I scrunched into it with the boat, and the barnacles scraped up the boat and didn't actually puncture any of the planking, but it did embed them fairly deeply into the planking. So fortunately, no permanent damage, but it's an issue. In Sunderland Channel in 2016, off Johnson Strait, we had another interesting occurrence. I'm going to read a bit from the book about this. The day starts out well enough. The clouds move in overnight, which seems to be the pattern for this part of the passage, and it has fallen nearly calm in our little cove. We leave shortly after 6, and as soon as we get around the point, there's a light headwind, but there is either no favorable current or it is against us. We're only making about 1.5 knots, and the slow speed combined with the thick low cloud makes the morning particularly cheerless. After about an hour, the wind increases enough that we can sail, albeit directly to windward. With the sails up, I make good time, much faster than I can row. This feels like progress, and despite the dreary aspect of the dim light, I feel much better. I cover about 3 miles and make it to just past Seymour Island in the center of the channel when the wind increases to a point where I have to put in a reef. I go through my usual routine as centering the mizzen, rounding up into the wind and dropping the foresail. I go forward and tie in the reef and raise the sail again. As I move aft to set the sheet and take the tiller in hand, a strong gust of wind comes up and catches the sail. Suddenly the boat heels right over and buries the lee rail deep in the water. I reflexively grab the end of the boom to keep from getting thrown out of the boat, but my butt, the tops of my legs, and my torso right up to my armpits are submerged. The gust slackens and the boat pops upright again, but is full of water. I was knocked down, but fortunately not capsized. I'm too surprised to be shocked by cold water, and anyway, I put on my floater coat earlier for warmth while sailing. While I'm thoroughly wet, the neoprene of the coat is now doing its job. Time seems to slow to a crawl as the adrenaline kicks in. everything that was loose is floating, but a quick glance seems to show that I haven't lost anything. First order of business is to get the sail down so I won't be knocked down again. I slosh forward and quickly drop the sail, untie the bucket from the pin rail, and crouch in the center of the boat and begin bailing furiously. As you may have guessed, I didn't sink. But we did have Tim was out of sight. He'd on opposite tacks, he diverged and it was on the other channel and was out of sight. And I'd radioed him and said, I'm gonna pull into this little rendezvous point. We'd always identified some potential bailout points at the start of the day, and this was the first one. So he came rowing in about an hour later. He'd missed the whole thing. More serendipity. When I was coming south in 2017, I'd taken a rest day at Clentu, and I'd gone to look for a place to have a shower and didn't find it, but I did manage to have a wash in the river. And as I was coming back to the main dock here, this boat was sitting there, and it turns out it was a boat called the Grace B, a type of boat called the Crotch Island Pinky, and it's owned by Ernie Baird of Port Townsend. And they were returning from the race to Alaska. They'd taken part in that and ended up in Ketchikan, and then were motoring the boat back south. And I knew two of the crew, but hadn't met the skipper before. So it was a really interesting and a thrill to kind of meet them. And we sat in the cockpit and ate a bag of grapes and had a good gam. And because they had an outboard, they had a long miles to go. They took off and into the wind and the rain, I suspect. But I know they made it back because I saw them later that year. Some days were just terrific contrast, days of terrific contrast. When I was leaving Hartley Bay on the north coast in 2017, it was a perfectly calm, sunny morning all along Douglas Channel heading out, and a beautiful sunny sail on McKay Reach. But as the afternoon progressed, the wind got stronger, the rain started coming down, and the last half to 3/4 of an hour was this wild, wet downwind sleigh ride. So I surfed into Buttedale, where I'd never been before, and waves are just rolling right in past the dock. When I finally found shelter just on the inside of the dock, there, just about a one fire drake space, and tied up there and spent the night there. It rained for the whole 14 hours that I was there, but I had a good visit with the caretaker. Unfortunately, I didn't see there's a spirit bear apparently comes down from the cove there, and she didn't put an appearance when I was there, unfortunately. So alongside Princess Royal Island, south of Buttedale, is, it's the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest, and traveling slow and power, you see not only major waterfalls like this one alongside the island, you see and hear all the small ones that aren't marked on the chart, and I'm pretty sure there's one every 200 yards. You hear all the birds, the Swainson's thrushes, the Pacific wrens, the crows, the ravens, and the Steller's jays. It really is a feast for the senses. This is probably the longest and hardest day I put in 2017. It was my last day in Grenville Channel. I'd started about 7 in the morning, rowed against the tide all morning, and nice sailing headwind had come up, and I rowed or sailed for 7 hours until the tide failed me in at about 7 o'clock, and then it was a long, long, hard row to get around the corner out of the channel and into Coghlan Anchorage here, where this picture was taken with the moon, following the sun down. The night wasn't terribly restful either. This is about 9:30 when I took this picture. The night wasn't very terribly restful because the wind was supposed to shift around to the north during the night, and I thought I'd be sheltered, and it didn't. And instead, these little rippling waves kept coming into the anchorage all night, and the boat rocked the whole night. Greenpoint. This is another situation where I got through in the fog and Tim hadn't. We knew we had to get to the south point of Greenpoint Rapids to wait for the tide to get through with our little boats, and I made it through. And I put the anchor down just not too far south of the rapids, and it started to rain. So I put the tent up, dried the boat out, made a big pot of coffee, and sat down to write my journal and read a book. And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I hear this clunk. And then a few minutes later, another clunk. I thought, that sounds like a bear turning over stones on the beach. And I stuck my head out, and then it was a grizzly bear turning over stones on the beach. So here's this grizzly, cinnamon-colored grizzly working, eating all the crabs under the rocks. and he worked up and down the entire tide line until the water covered it up. And Tim came along not too far later, and Bear wasn't paying any attention to us. He was pretty focused on eating those crabs. It's pretty cool to see. And I'll finish off with what I'll call a few gratuitous scenery shots. This is one of my favorite from the whole trip. This is just north of Desolation Sound, Gloucester Point, Price Channel. That's Toba Inlet, the beginning in the background. I really like to go back there sometime and just see what's at the head of that inlet. It just looks really attractive to me. Where you saw that rowing video earlier, this is the place I was heading for. I still have no idea how you pronounce that, but toward the north end of Grenville Channel. And what I was amazed at is that in spite of how busy the inside passage is, I found that I often had the most beautiful beaches and anchorages all to myself. So nobody else in this anchorage at night, and beautiful, sunny, flat calm in the morning. It was just gorgeous. And this was an absolute gem of a spot that I hadn't even intended to stop here. It's north of Clem 2. I was rowing all day, but the tide had turned and I couldn't get around Split Head or its point opposite on the channel. Even working the back eddies, there's a couple of points the tide was just too strong. It was probably 5 or 6 knots, and you rowing flat out, I couldn't get by. So I finally gave up and retreated about a mile back down tide to this beautiful little cove on Sarah Island. So white shell beach, sunshine, nice breeze to keep the bugs off, tree to sit under the shade, and even a freshwater creek at the end of the beach to wash in. It was just really a nice little spot to wait. And Journey's End in 2017. This is the dock at Port Hardy. It's the last day of the last chapter in the book. On the 2017 trip, I'd intended to go all the way to Victoria, but I got to Port Hardy and I'm up in the marina laundry room, sitting there watching my laundry, and I realized I just kind of had zero motivation to go anywhere further south. I kind of focused all my energies and efforts on getting safely around Cape Caution and this far. And from here on south, I'd be covering ground that I'd covered the year before, but in the opposite direction. So I figured, no, I won't push it. This is a pretty good end. I pretty much closed the loop on what I had mostly intended to do, and it was a great way to finish off the trip. And happened to be about 25 years worth of so I was satisfied. So thank you very much for listening. I'll leave this slide up. If does anybody have questions, if anybody's interested in the book and hasn't got it. The book's distributed in Canada by Red Duke Books in Duncan, Great Salisbury. So any independent bookstores in Canada can get it from Red Duke, or Barnes & Noble carries it in the US. Or if you're inclined to deal with Amazon, they have both print and Kindle versions. So with that, open it up to any questions. I'm afraid I can't see the chat thing.
Yeah, for sure. I can do the chat for you. So from Ian Miller, we have, do you have a particular sailing rig you prefer and why?
Yeah, the rig on Hornpipe was originally, I think the first picture you saw was a catch rig, which actually had 3 mast positions for 2 masts. And in theory, that gives you a whole lot of choice, but in practice, it was very difficult to shift all those masts around when the boat's moving and reef down. And the boat was kind of over canvassed for the size of the boat, which is one of the things I didn't like about it. So Hornpipe or Fire Drake, when I built that, it's a lug yawl rig. So it's a big foresail, about 100 square feet, and a small mizzen. And the mizzen basically acts like a balance and steering sail. And it has the advantage that when you're transitioning from sailing to rowing and back again, you put that up first and sheet it in, and it most of the time weathercocks the boat into the wind and keeps it steady. And then you can stand up the foresail. And the foresail is a balanced lug. It's a compromise between keeping the center of effort fairly low in what is mostly an unbalanced or an unballasted boat, and yet having enough luff area that you can snug down tight with a downhaul that you can sail pretty well to windward. And then because the masts drop out and stand up pretty quickly, the transition when you don't have a motor can be done pretty quickly. So I can go from sailing to rowing or in about 2 minutes and back again in about 2 minutes. So it's a pretty handy rig. I found it wasn't me that invented the rig. I really copied it from others, but it's a good one for this type of use.
Your next question is where to next?
Well, I actually developed a bit of a medical issue between the last 2 trips, atrial fibrillation, and my cardiologist tells me that he pointed me to some research that suggests that my decades of high cardio activity might have in fact contributed to it. So it's probably not a good idea for me to do a whole lot more weeks of 8 or 9 hours a day of rowing. So I caved in 2018 and bought a little outboard motor. So the last couple of years have been shorter trips so far with the outboard motor clamped onto the side. Not quite the same. It's more like motorcycling. I had a motorcycle when I was a young guy, and you eventually get used to the drone of the motor. So it's more like that. But who knows? Maybe I'm actively contemplating my old geezer boat. What happens when I get to be an old geezer? Maybe there's something similar in size, but with a cabin. So I've got a bunch of candidates actively under consideration, and it's been 4 years since I built a boat. So who knows?
And we'll take one last question before we finish up the talk today. We have, what drew you as someone from the prairies to build boats and explore BC's West Coast?
Some kind of character failing, I think. I have no idea. I mean, I had a canoe as a kid growing up in Winnipeg, but where the urge to try and do something with on the ocean, I have no idea where that came from. We've got a pretty good family history on both sides of the family, and there's not they go back like several generations. Not a sailor among them, as far as I can tell. I'm a genetic freak as far as my family is concerned. I don't know. I always felt at home. The first time I saw the sea, it felt like home, strangely enough, even though I'd never seen it before.
That's really great. Thanks, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this tea and talk. It's really great to have all the fun notes in the chat throughout. And also, I hope you were able to brew yourself a cup of tea before you joined us. This is our tea and talks, and unfortunately, we can't provide you tea for now. But if you do feel like supporting an island tea farm, West Home Tea is a sponsor of the museum and this event typically, and you can order from their website, westhometea.com. But for now, we'll leave you all with that. Our next speaker in 2 weeks will be Dave North, who is a volunteer here at the museum. And this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. So Dave North is going to be talking about this battle, focusing on the Royal Canadian Navy's rapid expansion in order to play an important part in the longest and most strategically important battle of the Second World War. So please join us in 2 weeks for that. And thank you all so much for coming. Hopefully we'll see you at a future Tea and Talk. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
She was there at the bar. She heard my guitar.